In July 1980, President Carter released Presidential Directive, out NSC 59, also known as PD 59, as a culmination of his administration's efforts to implement the strategic nuclear objective outlined in 1977 in Presidential Directive NSC 18. This article is a continuation of the review of the PD 59 memo that was signed by President Carter, with the second part focusing on the approach to targeting against the three high-level targeting objectives covered in Part 1 of this article. These objectives are the following: counterforce, countervalue, countervailing. The first requirement that President Carter outlined for targeting was a call to update pre-planned options to the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP. Gwynne Dyer simply describes the SIOP as the West's traffic plan for targeting potentially all of its nuclear weapons, which could include the US, UK, and France, depending on the war scenario against targets in the Soviet bloc. The SIOP was to be updated to provide pre-planned targeting of the Soviet Union, its allies, and its forces based on the high-level targeting objectives mentioned above, with the following requirements: develop effective retaliatory strikes, including launch on warning, or from reduced capability caused by a Soviet first strike. Then create flexible sub-options that leverage the remaining capabilities of command, control, and communication, also known as C3, to initiate a sequential series of attacks from a variety of options. 1. Military targets. 2. Industrial targets that support the military infrastructure and production. 3. Political control targets. And despite the aforementioned requirements, there must be sufficient strategic forces that are both survivable and capable of attacking urban and industrial targets. This section will include an option to attack lesser contingencies such as Cuba, Vietnam, and North Korea. The SIOP also included an option, specifically for ICBMs, to launch on warning. This option allows the U.S. to launch a nuclear attack based on a warning of a Soviet nuclear attack, which can range from detected pre-launch activities of the Soviet Union to just prior to the detonation of nuclear missiles against Soviet targets in the U.S. Strategic bombers and submarines of the nuclear triad do not have to launch on warning, as their mobility would give the commander-in-chief flexibility on how to deploy these forces. PD 59 did not provide specific instructions for a U.S. nuclear first strike, as launch on warning is considered a retaliatory strike. However, it did provide additional pre-planning options to launch both a general nuclear war to support the mutually assured destruction, or MAD, strategy, and also a pre-planned and sequential list required for a limited nuclear war involving strategic nuclear forces. PD 59 necessitated enhancing the flexibility of U.S. strategic nuclear forces beyond the pre-planned options, enabling quick creation and implementation. The aim was to enable the U.S. strategic nuclear forces to adapt to evolving situations that generate new objectives and priorities, which the pre-planned options are not adequately equipped to tackle. This flexible scenario option appears to closely align with what Russian President Putin announced last month when he ceremoniously announced updates to Russia's strategic nuclear doctrine. Simply changing a nuclear doctrine on short notice, as the Russians claim to have done, requires a certain level of planning infrastructure to implement, so it was less likely to be a change to the Russian doctrine than to announce its flexible options, unless they were bluffing. President Carter outlined the infrastructure needed to support a flexibility option outside of pre-planned attack options of the SIOP. President Carter outlined the need to maintain these capabilities in peacetime, during nuclear crises like the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, and during a protracted conflict. Planning staff capabilities need to be created to create operational plans on short notice based on available intelligence. The levels include the following: all unified and specified commands that possess nuclear forces, National Command Authority to coordinate and integrate nuclear force employment for all commands, intelligence and target development that can identify a broad range of targets. Any targeting option, whether pre-planned or flexible, must leave a sufficiently substantial reserve force that is both survivable and capable of subsequent use. Without going into specifics, this reserve force would comprise submarines, strategic bombers, and the proposed mobile version of the MX missile, later known as the LGM-118 Peacekeeper. The initial plan for the reserve force was to use it as a counter-value targeting asset, threatening the Soviet Union's population as a potential deterrent against further Soviet attacks and an incentive for a negotiated end to the conflict on terms favorable to the U.S. The document, however, mandates an increase in the reserve force over the next 2 years, through 1982, to enable it to surpass the current counter-value targeting and bolster the countervailing strategy. This meant that the U.S. was preparing both the staff, infrastructure, and weapons to conduct a prolonged nuclear war that was well beyond the nuclear spasm of the MAD doctrine. The interesting factor of employing the countervailing strategy over the next 2 years is an interesting consideration for the weapons available in the timeframe of the Directive, 1980 to 1982. Planning would assume that a prolonged limited nuclear war would assume that land-based ICBMs would be largely used or destroyed, and the U.S. did not have the capability to reload ICBM silos without considerable repair time. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or SLBMs, both the Poseidon C-3 and the expected Trident YC-4, were not considered accurate enough to be used for anything outside of counter-value targeting. The Trident II D5, considered to be sufficiently accurate, did not become available until 1990. The Carter administration canceled the B-1A Lancer high-altitude supersonic strategic bomber in 1977, and the B-2 Spirit was experiencing significant delays. Congress continued to debate the expense and opposition of the mobile version, ultimately leading to the scrapping of the MX ICBM, which was still 5 years away. This meant that the only weapon system available for the strategic nuclear forces to conduct countervailing missions in the 2-year horizon was the B-52 Stratofortress. The flexibility option would allow the NCA to coordinate targeting with the theater-level nuclear forces, so the land attack version of the nuclear-armed Tomahawk cruise missile would be available in 1983 and could support a countervailing strategy, but only at its extreme range. PD-59 in this section of reserve force and the creation of countervailing strategy had a gap between a new strategy and forces available to carry out the strategy. The only weapon systems available were the Minuteman II, Minuteman III, and Titan II ICBMs, which were considered vulnerable to a Soviet counterforce strike, or could be expended, through sequential use or launch on warning, in a prolonged, limited nuclear war, and the B-52H strategic bomber. Despite the aspirational strategy of countervailing, there was a clear gap in protecting ICBMs and providing weapon systems that could support it. Countervailing was a legitimate and controversial strategy, but at the time it was implemented, there was a capability gap to support it through at least the mid-1980s. Consider this factor when evaluating current Russian claims of new nuclear strategies within a relatively short time frame, as well as the capabilities of its nuclear infrastructure and weapon systems.